December 1299, on a low, wind-whipped plain 10 kilometers south of the great city of Delhi, something roared that most of the subcontinent had never heard. Not the thunder of a single army, but the compounded sound of thousands of hooves, the creak of heavy harness, the trumpeting of enormous beasts, and the faint scrape of bowstrings that had already loosened terror across half of Asia. For 70 years, the Mongols had been the engine of a new world. Fast, remorseless, seemingly irresistible. They had toppled cities from China to the Danube. Their name alone bent governors to submission. And now a Chagatai prince, known in some sources as Kutlu, spelled variously Kutlu Khwaja or Kutlug in the chronicles, had brought his mounted hordes toward the wealthy plains of northern India. How do you stop an army whose signature weapon is speed itself? How do you blunt a force built around mounted archers who could vanish like smoke and then return to cut a column to pieces? The answer that would emerge at Kili, sometimes spelled Kili or Kili in later sources, was not a single stroke of genius but a gauntlet of institutional innovation, ruthless politics, and a weapon older than iron: the war elephant. The battle would not only test tactics and temperament, it would force a brutal moral accounting about the cost of survival. If this story is a mystery, then its unlikely detective is Alauddin Khalji, the man who rose from obscurity to seize the throne of Delhi in the chaotic 1290s, and then change the rules of war in South Asia. Alauddin is not a comfortable hero. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as ruthless, even paranoid. Modern historians call him an efficient reformer with an iron will. Both are true. He was a usurper who consolidated power through execution and terror. He was also the architect of a military and fiscal system that allowed Delhi to hold its ground against predators that had swallowed empires. His is a story that insists we confront a hard question. Can ruthless methods be justified when the alternative may be annihilation? Before we arrive at the plain of Kili, we have to understand why the Mongols came and what they brought with them. The Mongol expansion was not merely military success, it was a transformation in how armies moved and sustained themselves. Their mobile units, composed largely of horse archers, were organized for endurance. Each warrior kept several remounts, allowing rides of astonishing range. Their composite bow, layered from wood, horn and sinew, packed an energy that outclassed many contemporary bows at range, and, in close quarters, was devastating. Crucially, their favorite tactic was the feigned retreat, a deliberate withdrawal meant to draw an enemy out of formation, into disarray, and then into a killing ground where the Mongol horsemen could wheel and shower arrows into helpless ranks. India presented both temptation and pitfalls. The subcontinent's cities and agricultural wealth were enticing. Trade routes funneled wealth through Delhi. But the geography and climate differed from the steppe. Heat, narrow passes, and the logistical problem of sustaining large cavalry and their remounts across long, unfamiliar distances. The Mongols had never faced an army that used massive war elephants en masse in front-line formations. For a comparatively sedentary state like the Delhi Sultanate, whose centers of power were urban and fortified, the challenge was to turn the advantages of the Mongols into liabilities. Enter Alauddin's program, not a single invention, but a comprehensive adaptation. He restructured the army into a standing force, paid in cash rather than feudal grants, which meant soldiers could be kept at readiness year-round and dispatched without the delay or unreliability of feudal levies. He centralized supply and logistics, enforced price controls to keep markets stable in wartime, and built an intelligence apparatus that watched the steppe as carefully as it watched court intrigues. Above all, he changed the way the state perceived its threat. No longer could a ruler treat frontier incursions as episodic raids to be tolerated. The Mongol menace required a continuous, expensive response, and that response would be paid for through harsh taxes and strict enforcement. These were measures that strengthened the state but also hardened its character. And then there were the elephants. War elephants had been present on the subcontinent for centuries, symbols of kingship and instruments of warfare. But Alauddin turned them into the central instrument of defense, not merely as a shock troop for breaking enemy formations, but as a mobile bulwark designed specifically to counter the Mongol style of fighting. The animals were trained to hold formation, to carry armored platforms or howdahs filled with archers and spearmen, and to wear protective armor themselves in some cases. Mounted on their backs, archers could fire over the heads of infantry or rain arrows into cavalry lines. Lance-armed soldiers could strike downward into riders, and the sheer size and smell of the animals could unnerve horses, which were not accustomed to proximity with pachyderms at sustained scale. Think of an elephant line as a living fortification. Where a stone wall was fixed and passive, a column of elephants could be repositioned, could absorb shock and then counterattack. From the Mongol perspective, whose tactics relied on the cohesion of mounted units and the psychological certainty that their prey's horses could be controlled and driven, elephants were a disruptive force. Horses, when panicked, did not simply bolt in neat directions. A panic could ricochet through a cavalry formation, causing collisions and confusion. Feigned retreats, dependent on controlled withdrawal and the temptation of pursuing light horsemen, became perilous if the pursuing cavalry risked charging into a wall of elephants. But elephants had weaknesses as well. They were difficult to sustain, requiring vast amounts of fodder and water, and susceptible to flame and loud noises. Their size made them valuable, but also obvious targets for concentrated missile fire. And against commanders who adapted, elephants could be outmaneuvered. The Delhi strategy, therefore, did not rely on elephants alone. Alauddin constructed a hybrid force. Disciplined infantry trained to protect elephant flanks, cavalry deployed to exploit openings, and fortified positions that could be manned by professional troops. Fortification work in and around Delhi, new walls, and a fortified outwork known later as Siri created fallback positions and supply hubs that allowed the Sultanate to absorb an attack and still retain the capacity to fight another day. When Kutlu's force appeared in 1299, the stakes were immediate. Chroniclers, writing with the drama of survivors, reported vast numbers on both sides. Modern scholarship advises caution. Medieval writers tended to magnify the scale of battles, sometimes wildly. We must therefore hold two narratives together. The contemporary account, replete with hyperbole, and a sober modern reconstruction that treats the confrontation as significant, though perhaps not the apocalyptic clash some sources suggest. Still, the Mongol threat was real and credible. Kutlu represented a continuation of Chagatai efforts to expand wealth and influence into the subcontinent, and his arrival was the kind of existential test that revealed whether Delhi could translate bureaucratic reform into battlefield success. On the eve of battle, the Sultanate's preparations were as much psychological as tactical. Alauddin's court, already unaccustomed to trusting generals freed from the old aristocratic bonds, now needed to enforce discipline within its own ranks. One of the tragedians of this story is a man called Zafar Khan. He was a man of the old martial caste, brave, charismatic, and fiercely independent. In a system requiring obedience to a centralized command, Zafar's temperament was combustible. To Alauddin, he was both an asset and a threat, a distinguished commander whose popularity and prowess could be a focal point for dissent. For the Mongols, men like Zafar were exactly the kind of opponent whose temperament could be exploited. The field of Kili lay between two low ridges, open enough for cavalry maneuvers, yet bounded enough to channel forces into concentrated fronts. Delhi's army deployed in 5 divisions, according to most accounts, each division fronted by elephants. Imagine 5 belts of living ramparts, separated by bodies of infantry and interspersed with cavalry squadrons. The elephants anchored the formation, creating an immediate psychological obstacle for any approaching horsemen. Behind them, archers and spearmen waited, trained to fire into any gap that opened and to support the pachydermal line. The Mongols, for their part, were precise in their reconnaissance and patient in their maneuvers. Kutlu's command reportedly included detachments of light cavalry and experienced commanders who knew how to probe for weak points. Their initial tactics were what the Mongols had honed for decades, a probing series of feints, short skirmishes to test the reactions of the enemy, and sudden charges designed to exploit any lapse. They wanted to transform a tightly held formation into a scattering of isolated groups, each vulnerable to the steppe archers' all-round fire. At dawn, on the day the battle would be decided, a grey mist clung to the plain. Visual range was reduced. Formations that might have been visible a kilometre away bobbed out of sight and then back into the half-light. The Mongol horse archers moved in waves, sending compact flights of arrows, retreating, and then pressing again to see if the elephant line would hold. For a while, nothing dramatic occurred beyond trading missiles and gauging. Then a pattern revealed itself. In several places, the Mongol horsemen simulated panic, sham withdrawals designed to trigger pursuit. The Delhi commanders had been warned about such tactics, but civil military discipline is a fragile thing in wartime. Zafar Khan, whose name already carried a weight among the troops, found such temptations hard to resist. He had a reputation for valor and for contempt of formal constraints. On the field, a contingent of Mongol horsemen began to fall back in what appeared to be a disorderly rout, rearmost riders turning and light hooves beating toward the horizon. Without waiting for formal orders, Zafar roared forward with a charge that would become the most controversial moment of the campaign. His elite horsemen thundered after the retreating Mongols, passing through the elephant belt and spilling onto the plain beyond. Pursuit was the very instinct the Mongols intended to trigger. What happened next is where history and myth entangle. Chroniclers later portrayed Zafar's charge both as heroic and as reckless. Modern analysts point to a tactical trap. The Mongols had long used the feigned retreat to break up enemy cohesion. Here, with the line of elephants behind and Kutlu's main force still holding, the retreating horsemen led Zafar into an increasingly narrow pocket of ground. The steppe archers began to wheel, and small Mongol contingents, previously held in reserve, closed the ring. Zafar's men were now in open country, cut off from the anchoring power of their elephant line and facing the full concentration of Mongol mobility. For a time, the scene was grotesquely cinematic. Pictures of the time would later show a halo of dust, horses rearing, banners tangling, arrows crossing like dark rain. Zafar's cavalry fought with the sort of desperate courage that can win legends. Contemporary chroniclers waxed poetic about his last stand. Folk memory would celebrate him for generations. Yet the battlefield is cruelly indifferent to virtue. Cut off and surrounded, Zafar's men could not re-establish contact with the main body. Attempts to break out were met with encirclement. Mongol arrows found seams in armor and lodged in exposed flesh. Horses fell, and without remounts the advantage of mobility evaporated. Back at the main field, Kutlu watched. His own commanders, seeing a portion of the enemy force drawn away and the rest held in place by elephants, sensed the chance for a decisive blow. Where the Mongol feigned retreat had achieved psychological leverage, the step now was to see whether they could break the elephant line itself. This would not be easy. The line's mass and the discipline of the troops around it made frontal assaults costly. But Kutlu's plan included careful flanking maneuvers and concentrated volleys of arrows, designed to unsettle the animals and their riders. If the Mongols could wound the elephants or disrupt their ranks, the cavalry would have the openings it sought. Ulodin had anticipated some of this. He had ordered reserves positioned behind the elephants, cavalry to plug holes, infantry to reinforce any place where a beast might panic, and officers to gauge when to commit heavier forces. But his greatest fear was the fate of those forward elements like Zafar's contingent. Once a commander left his assigned position and rode into the open, the commander's individual valor could not substitute for coordinated institutional defense. El-Ladin understood that the survival of the state required not just brave men, but a system that could withstand improvisation. On the plain, the tempo increased. The Mongol arrow storms intensified. The elephants, irritated and pained, trumpeted in confusion. Several of them turned, and in the resulting crush, riders were unseated and trampled. Yet the elephants did not uniformly collapse. In some places they held their ground, their howdahs blazing with arrows from archers who had been taught to maintain fire even as their mounts swayed. In other sectors, the Mongols pushed hard enough to drive wedges between the elephants, creating dangerous gaps. The main field was becoming a patchwork of successes and desperate resistance. Amid this chaos, a smaller, decisive episode began elsewhere on the field, an assault that would determine whether Kutlu's gamble could be made to pay. A concentrated assault aimed at the elbow of the elephant line found a moment of weakness. A combination of wounded beasts, exhausted handlers, and the centrifugal pull of scattered skirmishers. In that narrow window, a mounted Mongol party engaged in close combat with the men on an elephant's howdah, and with the mahout, the driver, himself. It is likely, given later reports, that a prince or high-ranking commander among the Mongols sustained a severe wound in this melee. The chroniclers would later attribute to this injury a decisive blow to Mongol morale. Modern scholars caution that details are fuzzy and the identity of the wounded is uncertain. Still, the image endures. A Mongol leader struck down amid the smoke and dust, pulling his riders into retreat. Zafar Khan, still isolated beyond the elephant line, would not live to see the day's strategic consequences. Surrounded and outnumbered, he faced offers of defection from Mongol commanders, offers described in the sources as attempts to avoid his wealth and prowess being lost to his enemies by turning him into an ally. The offer implied that a man of Zafar's stature could be useful if he switched sides. The sources suggest he refused, choosing death rather than accord with the invader. Whether that is true as a matter of private motive or later legend is debatable. What we can say is that his fate, captured, executed, and then in one of the most chilling details of the campaign, systematically erased from certain official records, became a crucial element of the tale. Alauddin, who celebrated the victory, also presided over an erasure that hints at the internal politics of a regime that could not tolerate a rival hero. The shadow of that political calculation stretched over the battlefield's immediate aftermath. While Zafar's column was isolated and destroyed, Kutlu's force, having paid a heavy price in the attempt to break the elephant line and suffering the loss or severe wounding of a prominent commander, faced a different dilemma. They were deep into enemy territory, far from their supply bases, and in a theater where the familiar logistics of the steppe no longer held. The Mongol horse archer model depended on sustained mobility and the ability to fall back across friendly ground. Cut off by both distance and an enemy that had learned to weaponize elephants and fortifications, Kutlu's command had to decide whether to risk pressing on or to withdraw and preserve the core of his force. Alauddin, who had watched the conduct of his generals, made choices that would reveal both strategic restraint and moral ambiguity. He refused to risk the main army in a reckless rescue of an isolated commander, even one as talented as Zafar. To order such a maneuver would have meant committing the elephants and the main divisions to a chaotic, piecemeal engagement that could have reversed the day's gains. In wartime calculus, this made sense. In human terms, it was brutal. The Sultan's decision to prioritize the institutional continuity of the army over an act of rescue sealed Zafar's fate and deepened the fissure between state necessity and individual sacrifice. By late afternoon, the plain had become a landscape of ruin and temporary triumph. Bodies littered the ground in places where the fighting had been heaviest. The elephants, some dead, some wounded, lay like overturned boulders, their last breath mixed with the iron scent of blood and the dust of hoofprints. Mongol detachments, mindful of the distance back to their bases and the uncertainty of supply lines in hostile territory, began to draw back in the face of losses that had not been anticipated. Kutlu's wound, or at least the rumor of it, had a psychological effect that clipped Mongol aggression on that field. Where confidence had been bold, doubt now took root. Even in partial victory, however, the cost was visible. The Delhi ranks had lost favorite sons. The Sultan had preserved his army, but at the price of hardening his rule. Chroniclers on both sides catalogued feats of courage and moments of betrayal, but they also reveal the limits of what contemporary observers could ascertain. Some of the medieval writers exaggerated numbers and outcomes. Others recorded deeds without full context. Modern historians, reconstructing from fragmentary sources, have to weigh the narrative flourish of a panicked chronicler against the logistical realities of the time. What remains clear is that at Kili, something significant had happened. Mongol momentum into the Indian plains had been checked by a combination of preparation, adaptation, and grim political calculation. And yet the story is not over. On the plain, that evening, tents went up while scouts sent cautious missives to distant commanders and to courts, unsure of whether triumph or disaster had been achieved. For people in Delhi, news would travel slowly, filtered through the court's channels and through rumor. For the Mongol commanders, retreat would not mean submission, it would mean reassessment. Their campaigns into the subcontinent would recur in later years, testing whether Kili had been an exception or a new model for resisting the steppe. For now, the plain breathed its exhausted breath. The elephants' trumpets had faded, and the Mongol banners began to fold in the deepening light. But beneath the surface of retreat and apparent victory, decisions were unfolding that would shape the political landscape of northern India for decades. Alauddin's reforms would be tested again. The machine he had built to defend the realm would demand resources and ruthless administration to keep functioning. Zafar Khan's death would be remembered in ballads and erased in official annals. The gap between popular memory and court propaganda was already widening, and the question that had carried the title of this story, "How did India stop the Mongols?" had begun to find an answer, but not a final one. It was an answer composed of elephants and cash, of harsh discipline and strategic restraint, of chance skirmishes and tragic choices. If you want to follow this unraveling, how Kutlu's wounding reverberated through Chagatai command, how Alauddin consolidated his power after the battle, and how the Mongol incursions returned in the next decade, only to be repulsed again. Stay with this channel and subscribe for the full examination of the Battle of Kili and its aftermath. As dusk settled over the blood-stained grass, two images remained lodged in the memory of anyone who had watched. A line of elephants, still and enormous, their harness licking the last light, and a solitary figure, Zafar Khan, cut off from the world he knew, surrounded, resisting offers that would have preserved his life at an unbearable price. Both images framed the same paradox. Victory demanded not only strength, but decisions that would haunt the victors. The night that followed was one of those rare pauses in history where choices, more than chance, set the future's track. Kutlu's captains argued about the wisdom of remaining in the field. Alauddin's advisors whispered about rewards and reprisals. The soldiers, exhausted, counted their dead and tended their wounds. Reports would be written, sometimes honest, sometimes self-serving. Later chroniclers would disagree about what happened next, about the exact manner of Kutlu's injury, about the size of the armies, about who had done what with which blade. But the field itself remembered in more elemental terms: footfalls, scorched grass, and the smell of iron. In the early hours, when the moon threw a thin, silver light across the plain, a small scouting party returned to the Delhi camp with news that would make the forthcoming days feverish. They spoke of a wounded Mongol prince being carried from the field, of confusion in the enemy command, and of columns moving away in the direction of the northwest. Those movements might mean retreat, or they might mean regrouping for a deeper strike once supplies and reinforcements could be secured. For Alauddin, for his generals, and for the captains of the Mongol force, the next steps mattered as much as the day's bloodletting. The battle had been decisive in mood, if not yet in consequence. And somewhere beyond the line of tents, in a small cluster of soldiers who had survived the worst of the day, tales of Zafar Khan's defiance began to circulate. They would be sung at hearths, whispered in market lanes, and remembered in songs that would not always align with the official record. The erasure of a man from court annals could not fully blot out the memory preserved by those who had been there. Memory, in that sense, became another battleground, between the file of coffers and the file of hearts. When dawn finally broke again, pale and determined, it would reveal tracks leading in more than one direction. Some pointed back toward the Mongol routes of retreat. Others led toward Delhi and the works that Alauddin had been strengthening for months. The war, which until now had experienced dramatic skirmishes, had entered a phase where logistics, politics, and the slow grind of supply would decide more than a single clash. The elephants that had been central to the day's fighting would soon need food and water. The cash flow that had kept the Sultanate's standing army functional would have to be sustained through taxes that touched every merchant and farmer. For those in power, the question loomed: how much cruelty would they be willing to accept to preserve what they had? Alauddin had already answered one way on the plain, by prioritizing the army over the rescue of a beloved commander, and that answer would reverberate in decisions to come. For the Mongols, the question was whether a force accustomed to taking by speed and shock could adapt its model to the subcontinent's different ecology of war. The next moves, political purges, fortification projects, counter-raids, and diplomatic maneuvering, would all be shaped by the memories of that day at Kili. The plain, for the moment, was quiet, but beneath the quiet was an electricity that only a few could see, the sense that something vital to the balance of power in Asia had shifted. The Mongol tide had been checked, at least for now, but the Sultanate's response had been costly and morally complicated. The rest of the story, the full accounting of who paid which prices and how the reverberations shaped Asia's map, was not yet written. The next phase would reveal whether Kili was the singular stand that broke Mongol expansion into the subcontinent, or a bloody chapter in a long, unfinished struggle. The days that followed at Kili were less like the cinematic crescendo of a single, clean victory than like a slow, deliberate passing of what survival required. Kutlu's column, wounded and diminished, moved on a route studded with small skirmishes and halting camps. Whether the prince himself lived long after the field remained a matter of dispute in the chronicles. Some witnesses recorded that he was grievously hurt and died en route. Others suggested his wound incapacitated the command enough that the Mongol leaders chose withdrawal rather than risk annihilation. Modern historians, working from fragmentary sources written by men with their own agendas, tend to treat his fate cautiously. Kutlu was likely mortally wounded, or at least seriously incapacitated, and his absence from subsequent Chagatai operations in the region was decisive for a time. Whatever the exact biology of his wound, the political result was clear. The invading army, stripped of momentum and facing supply lines stretched thin across hostile country, chose to retreat. A retreat, however, is never a clean erasure. It leaves behind questions of logistics, of what might have been, and of the people who were sacrificed in the meantime. In Delhi, Alauddin received the news with a mixture of triumph and calculation. To his court, the withdrawal was proof that his reforms had worked. A standing, disciplined military and a web of fortifications and supplies had turned Mongol ferocity into a manageable problem. But Alauddin was not a man who mistook tactical respite for lasting peace. His administrative instincts, already honed by years of purges, price controls, and a rigorous household economy, moved quickly from battlefield reports to long-term preparations. He accelerated construction on fortified works, shored up garrisons on likely invasion routes, expanded granaries and horse pasture networks, and tightened surveillance on the borders. The small city that would be known as Siri, part palace, part citadel, began to take on new strategic meaning as a nodal hub for the Sultanate's defensive grid. Even as the Sultan consolidated, the emotional aftershocks of the battle simmered. Zafar Khan's death was a wound that the court and the people could not reconcile in the same way. Publicly, Alauddin celebrated the victory, rewarded loyal subordinates, and issued proclamations emphasizing the Sultanate's security. Privately, the elimination of a popular, charismatic commander posed a political dilemma. A hero in the field was also a potential rival in court. The result was the most troubling of history's ironies. Official records and certain court chroniclers, those writing under or sympathetic to Alauddin's later rule, either minimized Zafar's role or omitted him from listings of honored martyrs. In contrast, the people who had been with him, the soldiers who had witnessed his last stand, preserved his memory in songs, in local tales, and in the simple but stubborn telling of what they had seen. This division between formal annals and folk memory would be one of Kili's enduring legacies, a public erasure that could not quite erase what had been burned into the conscience of the soldiery and the neighborhoods where they returned. Meanwhile, the Mongols did not disappear from the subcontinent's horizon. The raid of 1299, Kili, was followed by further probing campaigns in the early years of the 14th century. Chroniclers and later historians chronicle incursions that are often dated around the first decade of the 1300s, sometimes listed as 1303, 1305, 1306 in various sources, though the exact chronology and leadership across these operations vary by record. In these follow-ups, the Mongol strategy shifted. They continued to prize speed and flexibility, but campaigns became more cautious about deep penetration into India's interior. Rather than seeking immediate conquest, some Mongol commanders adopted persistent raiding patterns, harrying borderlands, aiming for rapid plunder, or trying to isolate weakly defended towns. Over time, they discovered that the subcontinent's combination of fortifications, climate, and the adaptive responses of regimes like Alauddin's made the kind of sustained conquest the Mongols had practiced on the steppe extremely difficult. Alauddin's response to these new pressures was methodical and at times brutal. He expanded the frontier defenses, improved his intelligence networks, and capitalized on the administrative innovations that had allowed Delhi to field a standing force. He also did something less honorable, but politically effective. He used the state's coercive machinery to extract the resources necessary for prolonged defense. Chroniclers of the period report new taxes, stricter enforcement of price controls, and the occasional public spectacle of violence intended to deter dissent. Here again is the recurrent paradox of Kili. The institutional success that preserved Delhi required social costs that hardened the state's face and, in some accounts, eroded civic trust. From a military standpoint, the Delhi-Mongol encounters after Kili illustrate how adaptation begets adaptation. The Mongols tested different approaches. Some attempts at larger-scale operations met with well-prepared garrisons and logistical countermeasures. Others devolved into raids that took what they could and retired. The Sultanate, for its part, learned to fight not just with elephants, but with strategy, layered defenses, pre-positioned supplies, and a readiness to fight conservatively when necessary. The construction and reinforcement of Siri and similar works were as much about projecting that defensive posture as they were about providing a retreat point. As one modern historian put it, the Sultanate turned Delhi into a bastion, less easily stormed and less hospitable to the particular strengths of steppe warfare. Yet to reduce the outcome to simple cause and effect is to miss the knots where strategy, chance, and politics bind. Kutlu's wound, in whichever way it is described by medieval writers, was obviously consequential. But a wound is not victory in itself. It was the combination of the wound, the inability of the Mongol forces to sustain a prolonged campaign in hostile terrain, the Sultanate's preparations, and the political decisions made in Delhi, above all, Alauddin's choice not to risk the main army for an isolated rescue, that created the conditions for Mongol withdrawal. Remove any one of those elements, and the equation shifts. If Zafar had refrained from his pursuit, if he had hewed to the discipline Alauddin demanded, some argue that the Mongols might have been forced into a different kind of engagement, perhaps more costly for them and for the Sultanate. Conversely, had Alauddin committed the main divisions to rescue Zafar at the cost of battle coherence, the Mongols might have exploited the disorder and reversed the day. Contingency, the role of individual decisions in a fog of war, shapes historical outcomes as surely as doctrine. The moral calculus, though, is what keeps Kili alive in memory and debate. Alauddin's choices were not merely strategic, they were ethical. By prioritizing institutional survival over the life of a single, if brilliant, commander, he subscribed to a logic of statecraft that demands ruthlessness in the name of continuity. His ruthlessness was not abstract. It involved public executions, enforced compliance, and policies that imposed real hardship on civilian populations. To some contemporaries and later commentators, these measures were necessary. To others, they were the signs of tyranny. That ambivalence is essential to any honest retelling. Kili's victory did not come without moral wounds that the polity paid in subsequent years through fear and repression. In the years after 1299, the memory of the battle was contested terrain. Court historians, often patronized or directed by the Sultanate, wrote narratives that highlighted Alauddin's prudence and the army's discipline. Folk singers, bazaars, and local minstrels carried a different set of stories. Those of Zafar Khan's courage, of individual sacrifice, and of the human price of statecraft. The divergence between these modes of remembrance is instructive. Official records are instruments of power. They shape what the rulers want posterity to believe. Popular memory, however, operates under different imperatives. It preserves small truths that do not always flatter the establishment. Over the centuries, ballads about Zafar's defiance circulated in villages and towns, outliving the inscriptions and annals designed to obliterate his name. It is worth pausing on what that popular memory tells us about history's human dimensions. Soldiers returned to homes where their wounds mattered more than dynastic proclamations. Mothers and families sang songs that valorized bravery, not policy. In these folk narratives, the moral questions were not abstract debates about the ethics of governance. They were intimate inquiries about loyalty, honor, and the meaning of sacrifice. The people who told Zafar's story did not care as much about the strategic calculus that saved the capital. They cared about the brave man who had died in the wrong place at the wrong time. History, therefore, becomes a palimpsest, an official script overwritten by the popular one, both legible to those who attend. From a broader strategic vantage, Kili's success had ripple effects across Asia's military map. For the Mongol world, the subcontinent remained a difficult terrain. Difficult not because Indian soldiers were less valiant, but because the environment favored defense and attrition. Steppe nomads excelled in mobility and speed. Their logistic model depended on large open spaces and networks of supplies that were harder to replicate across India's varied geography. Fortified cities, economically productive hinterlands, and state systems capable of absorbing shock made direct conquest costly. The Mongol campaigns that followed Kili were therefore more often limited operations or raids, rather than coordinated attempts at long-term occupation. This is not to say that the Mongols ceased to be a threat. They continued to harry and test borders. But their capacity to rout and incorporate the subcontinent into a contiguous political structure, similar to their holdings in Eurasia, was constrained. Another long-term dimension lies in military technology and doctrine. The war elephant's effective suppression of cavalry-based tactics in a particular era is a striking example of how old tools can be decisive when used intelligently. Elephants functioned as both physical and psychological instruments, mobile walls that disrupted the Mongol reliance on horse cohesion. But they also had limits. As the centuries progressed, the rise of gunpowder weapons and artillery would incrementally shift the balance. Firearms and cannon, first appearing in limited forms in South Asia several centuries later, eventually neutralized the elephant's battlefield role by enabling more penetrating fire and a reconfiguration of battlefield mobility. In other words, what had been a near-perfect counter to steppe tactics in 1299 would, in time, lose its decisive edge as military technology moved forward. The lesson is not that elephants were a mistake, but that tactical answers are often temporally bounded. A solution that is brilliant in one age may be obsolete in another. Kili also offers a primer in the interplay between logistics and politics. The Mongols, formidable as they were, could not operate indefinitely without supply, and the Sultanate's reforms had focused on the hard business of ensuring resources. Paid soldiers, organized granaries, and systems that prevented price inflation during wartime. These measures were as much military as they were fiscal. They represented a recognition that warfare against a predator like the Mongols was not episodic but structural. Yet they also imposed burdens on ordinary people. Collecting the taxes and enforcing the regulations required administrative reach and coercion. The balance between maintaining an army and preserving the polity's social fabric is one leaders in any age must weigh. And at Kili, that calculus tilted toward defensive militarization. History lovers often ask counterfactual questions. What if Kutlu had not been wounded? What if Zafar had obeyed orders? What if Alauddin had opted for a daring rescue? Each variation suggests a different pathway. Had Kutlu survived and retained the cohesion of his command, the Mongols might have remained a persistent menace in the plains of northern India, perhaps not conquering outright, but forcing a different, more costly equilibrium. If Zafar had restrained himself, the Sultanate might have preserved its valorous son and avoided the political shadow his absence created. If Alauddin had committed to a rescue, the Sultanate might have risked everything for one life. These hypotheticals underscore the central truth of Kili. Contingency matters. Small choices in the heat of battle, an officer's decision to charge, a commander's decision to hold or withdraw, can cascade into epical outcomes. There is, too, an ethical lesson embedded in the story. The costs of survival can be corrupting. The methods that preserve a state, surveillance, secret police, heavy taxation, purges, can also accumulate into a system that treats its subjects as means rather than ends. Alauddin's rule, strengthened by Kili, continued to rely on coercion. The benefits of security, peaceful markets, protection from raids, a functioning bureaucracy, came with the trade-off of diminished civic freedoms and a hardness at the heart of governance. History rarely offers pure victories, it offers compromises, often bitter ones. Kili's resonance extends beyond the immediate actors to the craft of memory itself. The battle became, over time, a prism through which later generations interpreted the relationship between military innovation and moral choice. In songs and courts, textbooks and blogs, Kili has been used to argue that adaptability can beat supposed invincibility, and that states survive not only with weapons, but with institutions that can launch and sustain defense. Yet the story also warns. Institutions require resources, and the extraction of those resources is itself a political act that reshapes societies in less benign ways. Centuries later, when gunpowder and new organizational models had transformed warfare, the sight of elephants massed in formation would be a historical curiosity, a reminder of a particular tactical ecosystem that no longer existed. But in its moment, the elephant was a decisive instrument, a pivot around which Delhi turned Mongol momentum into a strategic withdrawal. The arch of history sweeps on, and technologies alter the shape of power. Kili shows us how a well-timed combination of logistics, tactical innovation, and political ruthlessness can momentarily arrest a force that seemed unstoppable. As for the people of Delhi and the borderlands, the immediate effect of Kili was psychological as well as practical. Across the city, markets reopened. Trade routes, which had been nervy and erratic during the campaign, slowly regained confidence. For merchants and artisans, the reprieve mattered. For peasants and householders, however, it came tethered to heavier levies and the omnipresent gaze of the state. In that sense, the battle's outcome redrew lines not just in geography, but in social relations. Security, once bought, needed regular payments. Let us return, finally, to the two emblematic images that linger from the battlefield. The line of enormous beasts, elephants like living ramparts, and the solitary figure of Zafar Khan, surrounded and defiant. These images compress the narrative's contradictions. The elephants represent an institutional answer, a coordinated state-supported innovation that relied on training, supplies, and the synchronization of units. Zafar represents the human element, charisma, courage, agency, and the hazard of individual action in an environment that had begun to value organizational obedience over personal valor. The Sultanate's victory at Kili was a testament to adaptive governance, but it was paid for with choices that left their own moral toll. So how did India stop the Mongols? The answer cannot be reduced to a single factor. It was not just the elephants, nor only Alauddin's administrative acumen, nor Kutlu's wound, nor the heat and the terrain. It was the confluence of all these things. A state that reimagined its military and fiscal apparatus, a tactical employment of a native resource, the elephant, in a novel defensive way, the caprices of command and casualty, and the Mongol capacity limits imposed by long supply lines and an unfamiliar theater of operations. The victory at Kili was thus a mosaic, part design, part luck, part brutality, and part human heroism and folly. The lesson is twofold. On the level of strategy, Kili demonstrates the power of hybrid adaptation, combining local military traditions with new administrative forms to check a seemingly superior foe. On the level of ethics and politics, it warns that survival can demand choices that corrode the very social fabric leaders claim to protect. Alauddin's Delhi survived, and in surviving remade many of its institutions. But the cost, measured in treasury exactions, in censorship, in the erasure of some heroes, left marks that echo through later centuries. If you listen today to the folk songs that remember Zafar Khan, you will hear a voice that defies official erasure. If you read the court histories that praise the Sultan, you will encounter a narrative that privileges order and continuity. Both are true. History rarely offers us heroes unalloyed and villains unmixed. It gives us actors whose virtues and vices interact to produce outcomes no single person could entirely control. What should we take with us from Kili into our own time? Perhaps the modest, uncomfortable wisdom that strategy must be rooted in reality, the realities of logistics, of terrain, of human temperament. That statecraft requires moral choices that can haunt generations. that innovation can come from the oldest of instruments if deployed with institutional intelligence. And that memory, the popular songs, the court annals, the archaeological traces, will continue to argue about what really mattered. If this account has raised questions in your mind about Alauddin's ethics, about Zafar Khan's legacy, or about the broader lessons of adaptive defense, I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment with what you think. Was Alauddin's ruthlessness justified by the existential threat? Was Zafar Khan a tragic hero or a reckless commander? Like this video if you found the story illuminating, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten battles and the hard choices they reveal.